Hey, welcome back. This is Joel Duff. A little episode of Critiquing Creationism here, and what we're going to critique today is a new creation model. I'm going to call this critique The Perils of Time Manipulation, an evaluation of a new creationist model. Now, when I stumbled upon the what's going to be called the layered age creation hypothesis, I thought to myself, is this the next big thing in the creation debate? Is this a novel new idea that we'll all be talking about for years to come? Like, picture a universe where God fast forwards cosmic history through some spots and then slams on the brakes in others and then condenses it all into 6 days. It's a bit of a mind bending concept, but does it actually stand up to scrutiny? You know, I'm no stranger to the endless chatter there is on Facebook posts and groups and blogs and websites and, you name it. Wherever science and faith is discussed, you find me kind of hanging out there. And so, you'd think I've heard it all, but there's always new ideas out there. Somebody always has a new way, a new synthesis, a new way, a new approach to things. And so when I saw this link to a blog that I had never heard of, something called Odd Christian, challenging the consensus. And by the way, this background image behind me actually comes from the blog post itself. So credit to that particular blog for this. Of course, I had to check it out. I had to find out, what's this new twist? Is this something that maybe I'll find something new? And like, I'm always genuinely interested in further discussion and finding out whether there's something that I might be missing or can incorporate into my thought. So let's dive right in and dissect this new creation model and see if there's anything really genuinely new. Now, before I lay out my critique, I just want to give a nod to the author and appreciate him for sharing his ideas, putting them out there. I do think that these are going to end up being somewhat recycled notions. We'll see that in this critique, just sort of wrapped up in a new package with a new name. But it's worth kicking the tires on, what makes this particular approach tick. All right. Just to ask ourselves, how does this fit in the milieu of the many, many ideas that are out there? All right. So we've got that coming up next. All right, here we are on the Odd Christian Challenge the Consensus blog page. This is a page I've never been to this particular blog site before. I was only alerted to it by the author of this particular post, who posted this article on a Facebook group that I'm on today. And I thought, again, like I said, that we'd just take a quick look at it. And I'm going to do a critique of that. As myself being a professing Christian, a PhD scientist, a professor of biology, I'm engaged in the interplay between scriptural interpretation and scientific discovery. My scholarly work are really outside of taxonomy and molecular genetics anyway. And all my public discussions, including those that address young earth creationism, which are many of the videos that you find here on this channel, I've centered on assessing the natural world's data, the observations of God's general revelation, and whether they align or they fail to align with the various interpretations of the Genesis creation narratives. Of course, when I say the various narratives or interpretations, of which there are many, many of which are on the bookshelf behind me. Oh, yeah, sorry, you can't see that right now. I've got the green screen today. So in the face of a wide range of positions, especially over the last century, I recognize that Christians are faced with a challenging task. How do we remain faithful to Scripture while also engaging honestly with the evidence of the natural world, what that evidence presents to us? So it's in this context we come to this particular new viewpoint. All right. And this is the way it is promoted as, like, here's my thoughts on how we could sort of come to a consensus, and we could, like, I'll say, kind of like, have your cake and eat it too, right? Like, have the scientific evidence, have a specific interpretation of Scripture which pleases, the young earth creationists, but also tries to bring in the old creationists together. It's a way of trying to harmonize. to put it in the briefest of terms. So what this layered age creation hypothesis aims to do is bridge this perceived gap between young Earth creationism and old Earth creationist models. And he suggests that God created the universe with layers of time and instant maturity within 6 literal days. So layers of time, instant creation, somehow combined. And so this view is aspiring to account for both of course, the literal reading of Genesis, or at least what young Earth creationists insist is the literal reading of Genesis. And then the data, of course, encountered in the fields of cosmology and geology and biology. So upon reading the text, presenting this hypothesis, I do appreciate that this author has a real desire to uphold biblical authority, right? Is in that camp of saying, biblical authority is really, really important to me, just as it is to myself. But also they seem to have a commitment to finding some harmony between faith and science, and they're apparently recognizing that there is abundant evidence for at least the appearance that the universe is old and that organisms may have changed over time. But finding some way to have both of those be true at the same time, that the earth is young and instantly created, but also appears old. And you might be thinking, well, we're going to be going to the appearance of age argument, which I've talked about many times here on this channel. And in a sense we are, but we're going to take a different tact to get to that point. And so, maybe I'll just read right from this here. The layered age hypothesis offers a middle ground. It suggests God created the universe with layers of time and immediate maturity. Layers of time and immediate maturity, making everything fully functional within 6 literal days. This view combines the faithful reading of the Bible with what we observe in science. Now, I would say, for myself, that would be wonderful. If this really truly did bring together two views which many people have thought are completely contrary and not compatible with one another, and somehow we're able to make these two things meld together in a way that was consistent both with the observations of the world and biblical interpretation. I would say that's great. Now, as you might imagine, I'm unfortunately not quite as enamored with this idea as you might hope or wish. So what is the layered age creation hypothesis? This hypothesis proposes that God designed the universe with layers of deep time and instant readiness, similar to how a video game or virtual reality world might work. For example, a game designer can create a landscape with a rich history and full-grown features, even though it all comes into existence instantly. I guess when you boot up the game, it's like, boom, there it is. But yet it has this depth, and it has this, what appears to be a history of things that have happened, which isn't real. And that's where the apparent age hypothesis comes in, right? God creates with the appearance of history already in the rear view window, when in fact that actual history didn't occur. So here's how this author claims this works. We have layered time. On day 4 of creation, while Earth experienced 24 hours, the cosmos aged billions of years. So that's where he's going to fit in the rest of the universe and its immense age of billions of years. That's all squeezed into the day of the 4th day of creation. This explains how light from faraway stars could have reached the Earth, right? This is taking the idea of light in transit, right? That day there was a massive amount of time, but it was squeezed within 24 hours, kind of like time dilation. That's one idea that young Earth creationists have about how the universe can be so vast, and yet somehow the light actually came from those stars. Not that the light was created in transit, but the light actually came from those stars, was kind of stretched out. And so time is different, I guess you could say, in another part of the universe, but still fits within that 4th day. I know, does that make sense? Is it, is there any physics to support this? I don't think so, but these are things that other individuals have suggested in the past. So he's combining this with this layered time on day 4 with immediate creation. God created everything full grown, ready to function within 6 24-hour days, like trees with fruit, distant stars that shine. Well, now I guess he's saying, the stars are created distantly here, and mature ecosystems that work together perfectly. And then he has, you got the flood, all right? So he's still working in the flood. During the global flood, God structured time in ways that created fossils, rock layers, and continents quickly, explaining preserved tissues and multi-layer fossils without needing evolutionary assumptions. I don't really know how this would work. I mean, I don't know how this is different than just saying a global flood and all the things that young Earth creationists say about where the fossils came from. But so I don't know what God structured time in ways means. So core idea, layered aging, different speeds of time, right? On day 4, the universe was experiencing a different rate of time. All right, that's just saying the same thing that's said before. God's design, just as game developers create worlds and detailed histories, God designed creation with layered complexity. This to me all reads as pretty much just the typical arguments for God created with the appearance of age, which for some people says that allows me to see the age and say that the evidence actually does make things look like things are old, but God created them to be that way. The problem is when you toss in Noah's flood, which is something that I'm sure this author probably believes is only 4,000 years ago or 4,500 years ago, then all the things that happen in that flood, they really are recent. And so all those layers of rock, even though they make the world look old, they must have happened recently. I don't know, is he suggesting here that God made all those fossils look like they were developed by a world that had taken a long time to develop? That's just not clear to me. And then he goes on to explain a little more of the details here, but I'm just going to dig right into some of my concerns. So I do want to commend again, right, the intentions of this proposal. He really does want to uphold the authority of Scripture, maintain a faithful reading of Scripture, of Genesis. He's trying to creatively think of a solution to what he perceives to be as a problem. Now, ultimately, I'm going to find this hypothesis quite unconvincing, and unfortunately, I think that its weaknesses lie in all 3 different components. Such that I don't think it adds anything new. It doesn't solve really any problem that exists. And so, I mean, it seeks to solve a problem. Sounds like it's trying to solve a problem, but I think for everything that it thinks it's solving, it's actually creating 10 more problems. Don't worry, we're not going to go through every one of those problems. I'm going to try to keep it a little bit general here and just hit some of my I'll say core problems with this thesis. So I think the premise is that God not only created the universe in 6 literal days, but somehow embedded in those days what he describes as being time layers or periods of rapid aging. I guess that's accelerated processes, that the laws that God uses to govern the world operated at different rates in the past, or possibly in very different ways besides even rate. So according to this text, while the earth experienced a single day, the heavens might have aged, as we saw before, billions of years, allowing the starlight to reach the planet what seems to us to be instantly. And similarly, biological and geological features we observe, like mature ecosystems, somehow fully developed, their complex strata of geological formations and so forth, all on some sort of really accelerated temporal basis. Like maybe there's acceleration even during the flood year. And so, there's special appeal to unique conditions, during the global flood, used to explain intricate fossil records and geological complexity. I think this model ultimately tries to present God as the ultimate designer, right? Which is really no different than most other models in that sense, that God is the creator and author of all things. But in this case, it's like not only is the designer has orchestrated all creation with some instantaneous maturity while being fully functional in its final product, and yet having the appearance of and being able to discover how it all might have had history to bring it to that point, which is like, I guess in this case, like super design, right? It's like this has such incredible design in it that the design goes back as far as even showing how the organisms could have been formed in the mind of God. It's like almost like you can see into God's mind in terms of like, I'm taking these things and developing them into the things that they are, except that I'm going to then instantly make them into actual physical things rather than just mental constructs. So, as I said here, it's like akin to a programmer might create an elaborate virtual environment, imagining all those things, and then not until you like fire up the code that it then becomes real on a screen. Although I guess it's not, or still not a real environment, but it becomes something different than it was when it was just zeros and ones, inside of the mind of the computer, the storage area. The notion of compressing layers into a few days or short periods of time, there's no physical evidence for that. There's no observations that would support that. In fact, it's the appearance of age is actually an observation that suggests that didn't happen, right? There's nothing about those appearances that would give us the ability to say like, that looks like that was an accelerated, event to create that. No, the idea of creation of appearance of age is that it appears that everything was created under normal providential laws, right? The normal governance of the universe, that gravity and the strong force and the weak force and the other nuclear force and so forth are all operating in the same way, resulting in the apparent design that we see, which is based on the normal way of things working. And so there's nothing in the physical evidence, the observations we could make that would actually point to acceleration, even though this model is saying like, in order to get that apparent age, you have to have acceleration. One would think that one would be able to see, infer at least from something in the data that there was sped up stuff. Now, young Earth creationists like to appeal to sped up things like radioactive decay rates were different in the past than they were in the present. But that's been very difficult for them to argue for as well. Now, from a scientific perspective, I think the layered age creation hypothesis just brings about more confusion than clarity. That we were just mentioning the established uniformity of laws, the physical laws that uphold the universe, the way things operate today. It's that consistency that allows us to predict things in the future and to be able to understand God's creation. Now, it's without that consistency, nothing we know about the world would allow us to feel like we understood anything about the past or could know anything about the future, apart from exactly what God has told us. But I think he's given us minds and he's given us a consistent operating universe, and for us to be allowed to explore it and understand it, right? To name the things in the universe, which means to understand the things that are in his universe. To suggest the cosmos experienced billions of years worth of aging processes, while Earth simultaneously underwent only a single day, implies that these fundamental constants were manipulated or suspended in ways in one part of the universe differently than in another part of the universe. And we don't have any evidence that such a thing has occurred. The hypothesis, therefore, relies heavily on sort of yoking what we call divine action, right? That appears to be ad hoc, random. What's the purpose of this particular law being deviated from here, but not over here in this other place in the universe? And it's just not supported by self-consistent patterns we observe in nature today. And another significant issue pertains to the geological and fossil record. The Earth strata doesn't simply present random layers. They form an intricate pattern corresponding to long and complex processes of sedimentation, erosion, biological succession, so many different forms of data that suggest well-developed patterns within that fossil record, as opposed to a catastrophic flood, which would produce a more chaotic pattern for which we shouldn't expect to see the patterns that we see. To compress these processes into some short flood-driven event with sort of layered or accelerated time, again, that's just going to raise the question, why would God create such a detailed and internally consistent record of Earth's history in the flood, which really only lasted a year in the literal framework, right? When it was never intended to reflect the genuine temporal depth, right? Why would God build in temporal depth into and patterns of Earth's history into an event that only takes a very short period of time? Even if one argues that God's creation of mature systems right from the very start is analogous to creating Adam and Eve as adults, that's really the source and the most direct observation that people would point to support the mature Earth or mature creation idea. Even if that was analogous, the geological complexity and the astronomical data, they extend way beyond just functional maturity, like an endpoint that's like a mature thing. They suggest developmental history aligned with physical processes we currently observe. By invoking layered time, whatever this layered time is, I don't understand whether the flood is broken up into different parts in which there's like a really quick succession of events that occurred in some sped up time that created this layer, and then the next layer is something different, in which God is then placing in those layers in this accelerated time, like specific fossils for specific purposes. So by invoking these layers, whatever they are, the hypothesis provides no testable mechanism, right? It says, I don't know whatever. I don't even know what I'm going to test, right? No testable mechanism by which we can interpret the physical evidence. Anytime you invoke maturity, a mature age hypothesis, you essentially take away the ability to measure and compare hypotheses, because you can always invoke supernatural invention, slippage of time, and design of things instantaneously into your model to explain whatever you thought you couldn't explain before. So it lacks explanatory and predictive power, all right, which is the hallmark of a robust scientific model. Now, I don't think this author is necessarily claiming that he's proposing a scientific model, right? He's proposing a combination of a scientific model and a model based on an interpretation of Genesis. But I think there's like very little to no scientific model here, despite appealing to ways to understand the evidence. Now, what about theological and hermeneutical challenges? I'd say from a theological standpoint, the layered age creation hypothesis introduces questions about the character of God and its consistent message of Scripture. While it's certainly true that God stands outside of human constraints, we have to be mindful of how we portray his actions. By suggesting that God embedded complex temporal layers into creation, the model, I think, risks presenting a scenario in which the natural world is filled with like apparent histories that never actually occurred. This is the biggest issue with mature age theories. This gives rise to what many theologians term the apparent age problem, which some argue makes God seem deceptive. He's crafting a universe, right, which tells a story through physical evidence that, the traces that have been left behind by his creation, but they don't really correspond to genuine historical reality. And furthermore, this proposal, I think, treats certain biblical narratives, such as Joshua's long day and Hezekiah's sundial, as some sort of precedent for large-scale temporal restructuring of the entire cosmos. He does refer to these things as his evidence. Well, God's miracles, they certainly include events beyond ordinary experience. These passages clearly refer to local phenomena that serve specific redemptive and theological purposes. Whenever God interrupts, changes the natural laws, all right, goes against the normal providence or the thing you expect, all right? It's not just, happening irrespective of communicating some important thing that's a theological concept, purpose, some kind of redemptive portion of his interaction with human beings to send a message. I don't know what the message is if God steps in and changes the orbit of Mars, 5,000 years ago. It's like, hey, it was orbiting this way. Now I'll just change the orbit instantly. That doesn't have anything to do with his redemptive scheme, his redemptive plan. Doesn't have anything to do with a theological purpose, something he's communicating to us. I'd say extrapolating these isolated occurrences, which have some functional purpose here in how they've been presented to us, into some full cosmological principle just isn't warranted. And it conflates unique divine interventions with general principles of creation. In addition, the premise that God crafted multiple timelines to resolve modern scientific quandaries places a theological burden on the text. It shifts the interpreters from understanding the ancient context of Genesis and the theological truths that it's attempting to, or it is conveying, about God's sovereignty, human's place in creation, the introduction of sin, to using Scripture as a direct explanation for physical data, which, no ancient audience would have ever have imagined or asked these questions or be looking for those answers. That's an interpretive stretch, and that may obscure the intended function of Genesis as a theological and covenantal narrative, rather than a straightforward scientific treatise. And we got to remember that our interpretations should respect not only biblical authority, but also the literary and historical context of the biblical text. That's part of interpreting the text within the context of biblical authority. It's the authority. The authority comes from reading it correctly and finding the truths that are intended to be communicated to us. Beyond the realm of theology and we'll say science, I think the layered age creational hypothesis also raises some philosophical and practical questions. I think the model appeals to an exceedingly flexible view of divine action. Christians affirm that God can act in any manner consistent with his character. Proposing continuous, large-scale manipulations of time and history, though, reduces our ability to discern meaningful patterns in creation. That's the idea of consistency. If God wasn't consistent, if he's done all these different things over history, early history, and then in the flood, and he's engaging in these other, possibly engaging in these activities at other times, including potentially now, it makes it very difficult to understand and real patterns in creation, since some of those patterns are patterns of our imagination, right? Or they're patterns of what he's done outside the bounds of normal activity, except that we can't identify those, we can't understand them. If every natural phenomena might be the product of some incomprehensible temporal folding or accelerated process, to put it another way, then any empirical investigation is going to lose its footing. On a practical level, this approach just doesn't really offer a lot of help for Christians striving to engage the scientific community constructively. Scientific inquiry relies on testable, falsifiable, explanatory coherence, and a model that relies on untestable interventions and unvariable time layers places believers in a precarious position when conversing with scientists. And so instead of opting for a complex, largely untestable construct, I think Christians can embrace an alternative approach that does respect both scripture and science. I think those approaches already exist. I think they're well developed. I would encourage this author to, explore some of the things that are in explore maybe text like this one, right? Which interestingly, the manifold beauty of Genesis 1 and the subtitle there, I don't know if you can see that. All the way up here. a multi-layered approach. Like a multi-layered approach. Um, so here we have this layering idea, the layered age creation hypothesis. But this book is a multi-layered approach. Now, this reference to a multi-layered approach is that he's going to look at 7 or 8 different layers, which are really just 7 or 8 different, well, actually 7 different approaches to how to understand the text of Genesis 1. And these are all by faithful Christians who have, are earnestly seeking to truly understand what God is trying to communicate to us. And the idea of a layered approach is that, in this case, a layered approach refers to there are good points made. There are multiple different things, let's just say, that God is communicating through Genesis 1. And some approaches tend to focus on one or the other, as a polemic, for example. Actually, what other? As an analogy, as a polemic against ancient Near East cultures. Some emphasize the covenantal nature of Genesis 1 and language in that. Some emphasize the temple imagery in Genesis 1. Some are emphasizing the calendar that the ancient Israelites used. Some emphasize the importance of the land, right? The importance of what will be the promised land eventually. All these are things that I think all Christians can recognize are themes that are in Genesis 1. And there are many Christians who have built entire, constructs of how to understand Genesis 1 as it applies to the rest of Scripture that really focus on one of those, and sometimes a little too exclusively on one of those. And that's kind of the point of this book, is it's saying that, some of these constructs, some of these views, right, or approaches, have been, promoted as like the answer, like here's how to interpret Genesis 1 within this framework. When maybe there are 5 different frameworks that all contain, many true messages from Genesis 1. And by taking all of those, maybe that's a better layered age approach. All right. I would encourage the author to read that book, because it'll provide a number of different positive ways to understand Scripture, which allow for, at the end of the day, when you look at all of those, you say, like, what do they all have in common? What they all have in common is that it shows that Christians have a consensus of a number of different things that Genesis is teaching us. And that consensus doesn't really necessarily include something about the age of the earth, right? Our questions about physical origins, it's about who the creator is. And he did create, but the exact mechanism of that creation isn't necessarily a component really of any of these theological layers to Genesis 1. So I don't know. I hope I'm offering some constructive criticism of this layered age creation hypothesis. What we need is, I think, a willingness to engage in ongoing conversations. And I do appreciate that this author is sort of putting this out here as a piece of conversation. And I'm hoping that this feedback is something that is helpful for that. I think we always need to learn insights from fellow believers, from theologians, from scientists, from historians of the church, right? We're constantly seeking the wisdom that God has given to multiple different individuals with their gifts to try to understand this world better. Really, over the centuries, the Christian tradition has navigated a whole bunch of really profound shifts in cosmological understanding, right? From geocentrism to heliocentrism. And I think they've done that without losing the essence of the faith. And that's one of the lessons I often give to people. One thing that I'm often asked about is, what's the answer? And I say, like, there's been enough people that have searched, for like the absolute correct understanding of Genesis, and how to integrate every piece of knowledge we've ever come across, every piece of data we've ever collected from the earth, and have it all just make sense. But that's a lot to ask, and it takes time. I mean, just look back at geocentrism and heliocentrism. It took a couple hundred years, all right, to resolve that issue. And that's something that there isn't really much conflict about anymore, right? And yet at one time, you would have been like, oh boy, what do I do, with these observations? And I have scripture, and you've been wringing your hands all the time. So I have found that I am much more comfortable with, hey, I, don't know every single answer, and there's new things every day. I do have an open mind to trying to learn new things, because that's one of the great things about God's creation and how He's made us, is that we are constantly learning and understanding more about this world. So, I look forward. I encourage Christians to continually explore models respecting both the spirit of the biblical text and allowing themselves to see the evidence presented by God's natural world, by Christians and others who collect that evidence, and allow us to explore it. Right? Our ultimate aim should be to testify to the truth in the manner that is honest, intellectually robust, spiritually edifying. And no, I'm not saying that, this particular blog post is not honest and I don't think it's necessarily intellectually robust, but I think it's a great start for someone who's grappling with this and really trying to think through and trying to come up with some ways to integrate science and faith for themselves, recognizing that obviously they see the challenges, right? They see the problems. And so I understand that's frustrating to not have the answer, right? And this individual, I assume, has read some things, or read different ideas, and not been happy with any of those. And that's why this particular construction. I do think there's an immense amount of literature out there. I mean, I have a couple hundred books that have some relationship to these questions. And I have not read all of those. And it's very, very overwhelming at times. How much has actually been written about this. So I guess finally, I'll just say, in our scientific age, we have really an unprecedented opportunity to explore and understand God's works. For some people that's frustrating. It's like, well, the more data we have, the more complicated things seem. I think it's just more amazing, what we can know. And so I think we should embrace these opportunities, and rather working against them with, I think, what are ad hoc constructs. I think it allows us to appreciate the intricacies and vastness of creation. So with this posture, I think we can trust that all truth is ultimately God's truth. We can continue to wrestle with scripture and science. I think we can be confident that honest engagement will eventually yield a deeper and even more authentic faith and understanding of the world around us. So that's the layered age creation hypothesis. Now, I'm not sure that if you've made it this far, whether you understand what the layered age creation hypothesis is, because I'm not sure that, maybe it's obvious. I don't really understand the ins and outs of this. I think this is a broad-based proposal without, hasn't really been fleshed out to any great degree. And so I think this individual, and again, I haven't been in contact with this individual, don't know who it is, don't know what their background is, although I am intrigued by a little bit of their bio, because he and I do share what appears to be a pretty close connection in terms of our theological upbringing. And so I think we would have much in common theologically. What was I saying? Yeah, I don't know this individual, but I'm imagining this as a first foray into, I'm really thinking about this, and here are some of my ideas. And so this is just my general feedback on that. And I would encourage him to keep exploring, keep reading. I appreciate him putting this out there. for me to take a look at. All right. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me, and hit like, subscribe, all those things I'm supposed to say. And we'll see you when we see you. Bye-bye.